Hello and welcome to our Empowering Law Firm Leaders podcast, where we'll be talking to experts across the legal sector to discover the mindsets, behaviours, skills and digital tools that are needed to run a successful modern law firm. I'm Amy Bruce, host and marketing director at Osprey Approach. Today I'm joined by legal tech expert, formal technical director and now founder and managing director at Catcher, a dashboard and analytics reporting solution for law firms, Graham Moore. Welcome, Graham. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Amy. Great to be here.
So today we'll be discussing how to predict the future of your firm's success. We'll cover how firms can unlock the power of their data to stay competitive, how to benchmark your analytical maturity, best practices for improving your data utilization, and the behaviours and mindsets that set innovative firms apart from their competition. So first, Graham, tell me a little bit about your background and your experience that's led you to where you are today.
Okay, yes. So I suppose first and foremost, fundamentally, I'm a techie. I love solving problems. And I think I've discovered over the years that's particularly for business customers. So, some techies just like to solve problems for the sake of it, but I've always tried to find problems that I can solve where I can add value to somebody else's business. And I started my career as an engineer. I was in electronics and completely by accident, I moved into software. But I suppose, my first big break in terms of where I've ended up now is I got a job leading a software team for a legal practice management system in a firm very much like Osprey is today. This was a long time ago, so 35 years ago. I knew nothing about the legal sector, but I spent my time learning, and I soon realised there was plenty of problems out there to solve for somebody like me, and started to build a career in that sector. I love learning, and particularly focused on financial management. I think in the early days in law firms when time recording systems and billing systems were just evolving on computers. About 14 years ago, I set up Catcher because I'd seen how much firms struggled with getting their management information together. I knew we could do a better job, and I'd been trying to solve that for many years in my life in practice management. And I discovered in the end it was impossible to do that within a practice management firm because ultimately every law firm's different and every law firm's requirements are different. And you really need to focus just on that one piece in order to do it really well. And that's what I wanted to do. So yeah, over the years, we've built a team, built a base of happy customers, engaged customers, I hope, and it grew steadily. And now I'd say, we've become the supplier of choice for SME law firms that want fast, clear, and easy access to all of their data. So yeah, that's how I've ended up where I am today.
Yeah, absolutely. There are plenty of problems to be solving, of which good data is definitely the answer. So I just want to jump into a few quick takeaways. Let's say the listeners only have these 5 minutes to tune in. Hopefully they can stay for the whole conversation. But with your experience of working with hundreds of law firms, what are the three things you've learned that are crucial for running a successful modern law firm?
Yeah, so this is something that's changed a lot in the 35 years that I've been involved. Back in the early days, it was really difficult, I think, to find law firms that even accepted that they were running a business, and I think the key thing is to embrace the fact that you're running a legal business. And I particularly choose the word embrace because I think back then when I first started, people didn't even accept it. Today, everybody accepts you've got to run a business in order to deliver legal services in 2025. But I think the crucial difference is where firms really embrace that fact. That's where they can really become successful. Still, I get the impression that in a lot of firms, they hate the idea of marketing. They can't even use the word sales. I'm sorry, but if you run a golf day, what you're trying to do is sell. You're trying to sell legal services, and you can't get away from that. So, I think the successful firms now really embrace the fact that they're running a business, and the type of business just happens to be legal services. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is focusing on the people. And and this is a common theme across business. Not just in legal, and I'm not the first person to say this, but I think within the context of law firms, it's all about all of the people. So, yes, to have a successful law firm, you've got to have good lawyers. You don't necessarily have to have great lawyers, but you've got to have good lawyers. They've got to get everything right. They've got to deliver the service. But you need more than that. You need good people in all aspects of your business, in the marketing, in the IT, in all aspects of support around the law firm. One of the things that I would really say to anyone in a law firm, just ban that phrase non-lawyer. That idea that there's one group of people who are important, who are the lawyers, and then there's the people that support them. It's just not the way to build a successful business. You've got to build a culture where everybody wants to contribute to the success of the organization, and it means getting the right people into your firm. This is something that I've observed in law firms over the years, but it's also a lesson I've learned from running my business, from running Catcher. When you've got the right people in place, everything becomes easier. So that's number two, focus on the people. The third one, I would say this, is use the data that you have. Law firms these days have so much data, and the vast majority are just only scraping the top of what potential there is in that in terms of what they can do with it. So every law firm has data. Most law firms worry about the quality of that data, but I think we can dive into this in a bit more detail later. But the data that you have, start to use it, because data-driven decision making is always going to be more effective than just relying on the hunch of a bunch of different people who will all tend to have different hunches, different intuitions. If you've got the data, you can actually get sound decisions and drive your business forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So embrace the fact that you're running a business, number one. Empower your team and create a culture that empowers everybody. I have to say the Catcher team have definitely got that at their core. I say it's because you're all Northern, but it's because you've got that culture that really empowers everybody and makes sure everyone's important. And then thirdly, use the data not only for knowledge sharing and knowledge management, but actually to predict things, to spot trends and analyze opportunities. So to start the conversation on data analytics, it'd be great for listeners to have a tool to benchmark themselves, to help them start their data journey if they know that they need to make some improvements. So I've heard you talk in other conversations about the 4 stages of analytical maturity. Can you share what those are and what that means?
Yeah, sure. So the stage one, the first one is descriptive. So that's what's happened. Then we move on to diagnostic. Why did it happen? Then we've got predictive. What will happen? And then we've got prescriptive. How can I make it happen? So descriptive, that's traditional reports. At the end of the month, producing a pack of reports, backward looking back at what's happened, describing, sharing what's happened, but going no further than that. The second level, diagnostic, this is about providing insight. It's about answering that question of why. So drilling down into the data. If you've got one number that doesn't look right, being able to drill down into that number to understand the makeup of it, why it might not be right, that's starting to get into diagnostics. And that's sort of a manual process. Systems that can actually do that for you, that can identify the exceptions, that's where you're really getting into true diagnostic analytics. The system's actually telling you what's going wrong. The third stage, predictive. So that's about forecasting. It's about looking forward rather than backwards. It's about things like what if scenarios. Cash flow forecasts are probably the only example that most law firms at the moment are looking at in terms of trying to predict. And really, I think that's in most cases driven by the bank. The bank say, we've got to know what your forecast is. It's a pain. Nobody really knows how to do it effectively. It's usually manual. Predictive analytics is all about taking that idea and actually automating it. There's huge opportunities now with things like AI and machine learning to actually enable people to look at different versions of the potential future. this is what is likely to happen based on a certain set of assumptions. But if you change one of those assumptions, how might that be different? What might happen then? So predictive analytics and forecasting is level three. And then prescriptive, this is really the holy grail of analytics. So building on top of all those base three layers, really getting with prescriptive to have systems based on what is known, actually describing what actions are needed to reach whatever goals you're trying to do, so you're trying to achieve. So, it might be that, the prescriptive recommendation is you need to close this office. You need to increase fee earner capacity in this particular team. You need to raise prices for this particular work type. That can all potentially be driven with analytics that are operating at this level four. And that's, like I say, it's the holy grail. Nobody's really doing that at the moment, but that's where the industry is going, and that's where everybody's driving towards.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of law firm leaders on here would agree that that's where they want to be. But where do you typically see most law firms sit on this maturity model? And not those that are using Catcher really well, because I'm sure that elevates them, but perhaps if they're coming to you, where are they typically sitting?
Yeah, I mean, virtually all law firms today are sat at level one, which is backwards looking. It's reporting on what's happened, but not really trying to do anything more than that, unless it's manual. And to be honest, a lot are even not even doing level one particularly well. If a law firm today is just at the end of the month producing a report pack that is backwards looking, saying what happened in the month that's already closed, then that's not even particularly effective descriptive reporting. What you really need, even with descriptive, is to have that up to date, have it day to day, have it real time, so that during a month you can actually see what your trends are, and you can see potentially what needs to be changed. Even if it's only manual, you've got visibility of that. So yeah, to answer the question, most law firms that we come across are still at that level one.
Yeah, and it sounds like maybe there's a spectrum within that level one, and actually waiting for the month end and just focusing on financials, like you've said, isn't you're still on the lower end of that stage one, and actually we could even improve on that descriptive level. So I guess that's reassuring for anybody who thought, oh my gosh, I've got a long way to go. Um, what are often the barriers that are holding people back from moving up that scale? What is it that's challenging them to move to stage two, stage three?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of really key barriers here. The first one is the technology. There are tools available to certainly do some really good stuff now at levels two and three, but they're very high end. They're expensive tools. Large corporations are using them. The vast majority of law firms would not be able to afford those. At Catcher, we're looking to see how we can bring those into the reach of SME law. But it's something that's moving very fast. It's an incredibly fast moving space. So the technology is certainly a challenge at the moment. But the second one, and this is potentially more fundamental and more long term, is trust in the data. So it's okay saying, based on your data, we can forecast forward. We can potentially suggest what you should be doing. But our experience is the vast majority of law firms just don't trust the quality of their data. So if they don't trust that underlying data, they're never going to trust the outcomes, quite rightly. If it's garbage in, garbage out, that's been the saying in the computer industry for as long as I've been in it. So quality of data, trust in that data is a huge barrier, and it's something that every law firm today should be looking at, how they address, because until they do that, they really can't move up through this hierarchy of analytics.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we'll probably touch on it a little later, but where you say you can't trust it, is that typically because they don't really know what they're inputting very well, or is it typically they don't trust the people and why they're inputting these things very well? Like you said, garbage in, garbage out. Where is the trust issues coming from, do you think?
Yeah, so I think the interesting point is that if you ask most people in a law firm that have any knowledge of this, they will say they're fairly well trusting of their financial data. You know, the finance systems that law firms use are pretty rigorous, and there are lots of controls in place to make sure that everything balances and that everything is closed down and all the right categories are used. And all of that is in place because there is external scrutiny of that. You know, the SRA will come in and they will look at your finances. You know, these things have to be reported. Elsewhere, in pretty much every other aspect of law firm data, if the data is not being used, if it's not being scrutinized by somebody other than the person who's entering it, there is the danger of it not being entered correctly. So, classic example: what's the source of business for all of your new business in the last 6 months? And in the vast majority of law firms that we come across, and I've been saying this now for 20 years, you know, the most likely source of business is, well, it's whatever is number one on the drop down list that they're presented with in their matter opening sequence. And you know, and the reality is, it will always be that until people start using that particular piece of data and feeding back, this data is rubbish. It has to get better, and there needs to be a why. At the end of the day, you know, we all know the start with why idea. You know, if people don't understand a reason for doing something, they're not going to do it. So if you accept that your data is rubbish and you don't use it as a result, it will always be rubbish, and you'll never be able to use it.
Yeah, that's a great shout and great advice. And to be honest, maybe shouldn't admit it, but it's not just law firms that have this problem. It's definitely across all the sectors. Data isn't sexy, so it tends to be something that's left, even though it's so crucial. It can help you make so many great decisions. We had CJ Anderson on the podcast previously who spoke about um, data is your answer to the question, wouldn't it be nice if we could dot dot dot. There's always ideas that start with that sentence,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
it's data that can answer and fuel that of whether it's possible or not. But
yeah,
if you've not collected it, you're not going to be able to answer that effectively.
yeah, absolutely.
I guess that goes back to your gut feeling as well. If you've not got the data, then you're relying on hunches and gut feelings, which, you know, we've probably all got different versions of that and different thoughts and opinions. So yeah, great shout on that. Um, let's talk about innovative, successful, leading law firms. What sets them apart? What behaviors, mindsets, tools are they embedding? Have they already embedded that's helping them stay competitive?
Yeah, so I mean, I think some of this I've touched on already. Back to the first question. I think the starting point is a commercial mindset. You know, if the mindset of the law firm or the leadership of the law firm is primarily commercial, then that makes a huge difference. You know, the decisions are being made for the right reasons in order to create a successful firm. Um, I think. Possibly more controversially, a lot of the successful firms that we see are not necessarily run by lawyers or exclusively by lawyers. Um, Lawyers are trained to be risk averse. You know, they are not necessarily entrepreneurial. In fact, very few are actually entrepreneurial. They don't want to take risks. And yes, you can. There are some fantastic law firm leaders who happen to be lawyers, but it's not a prerequisite. And the whole idea that to run a successful law firm you need to be a lawyer, I think is in this day and age is just nonsense. And a lot of the firms that we see doing really well, the leadership, you know, irrespective of job titles and things, but the people who are actually leading and driving the business are not lawyers. And I think that's a key differentiator. Um, I think the third thing is some sort of focus. And this again, this is a general business thing, but it is sometimes difficult in the legal sector. Um, but firms need to develop a niche. They need to differentiate themselves. One of my favorite quotes from a guy called Kevin Kelly, who's an author and wrote for Wired magazine for years. He always says, "Don't be the best, be the only." And you know, and it's great to say I want to be the best law firm in my town, But it's so much easier to say, I'm the only law firm in my town that does X. And when you are the only, it makes everything else much simpler. Just like Catcher, that I've built this business on that basis, that we are the only provider of a dashboard and reporting solution out of the box for mid-sized law firms. And, and that's great when you're in that position. You have competition, but you have no direct competitors. And law firms that are successful today, I think, are very often taking that mindset. We're seeing a lot of family law specialist firms popping up, just focusing on one type of law, for example. In terms of catcher customers, Stephen Scown, a long-term customer of ours, they've differentiated themselves on the structure of the firm, employee ownership. They were the first employee-owned firm. They use that. They use that for recruitment, for motivation of their team, and that's really important in your success. Firms like Stepford's, the consultant lawyer model, differentiating yourself. It doesn't have to be. There's no one way to do this, but identifying your own particular niche. Another example, Bates Wells, another customer of Catcher. They're all about their being a purpose-driven business, and that affects their brand values and the clients that they work with, and it just enables them to be really focused on doing one thing and doing it well. So yeah, I think they would be my key points on that, that I'm seeing now, and they're all trends that have emerged really over the last 10 years probably.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that idea of don't be the best, be the only. And you're right, like it's such a competitive market to be a law firm in the UK, and to just simply say we deliver great client service or we're your advisor or your partner just isn't good enough, because the clients are so confused. There's so many of them to choose from. So I love the example of the employee-owned trust, because that initially doesn't feel like a unique perspective from the client point of view, but actually I can imagine it creates a really unique law firm based on the type of people they hire and the way they behave.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Also going back to your second potentially controversial point, about having non-lawyers as leaders. And actually, I think that touches on your point before about making sure everyone is contributing and understands their contribution to the firm. And actually, sometimes it takes an outsider and a disruptor to do something slightly different, maybe find your niche. Maybe they're the key holder to finding your niche is hiring someone that hasn't been in the legal sector before. I think that's a really good recommendation. I saw in a previous LinkedIn post that you shared your most asked question from your client base, and I think our listeners would want to know the answer. So the question that you're asked the most is, what are the KPIs other law firms are measuring? People always want to know what's going on. Are they the ones left out? Has everyone got FOMO? So can you answer that question? What are the typical KPIs that other law firms are measuring?
Yeah, I will answer the question, but first of all, I would say actually it's the wrong question to ask,
Okay.
because just wanting to do the same as the law firm down the road
Yeah.
is not a good it's not a good strategy for success. Back to the previous things I was talking about. I really used to love the story of the Oakland A's that was in the film Moneyball. I don't know whether you saw that, but American baseball team, and they were constrained because they were much lower budget than a lot of the other teams. And it's a really famous story now, as a guy called Billy Bean came in as effectively CEO. I don't know what they call them over there. And they completely shook up that team by changing what they measured. They were doing like everybody else. They were measuring exactly what everybody else measured. When they were looking to recruit new players, they were looking at batting average, home runs. They were using a lot of intuition and gut feel. Does he look like a baseball player? And that was the way the industry had worked for years and years and years. And very often I think that's how the legal sector still is today. It's how much time is he recording, and how much is he billing, and just measuring the same things. What they did at the Oakland A's was they actually looked at the data, they analyzed the data, and they worked out what was actually more important for more significant and what had the closer correlation to actually being successful. And they identified other KPIs. There's things called on-base percentage and slugging percentage, which means nothing at all to me. But in the story, it was a really successful strategy, and they went from being a sort of regular bottom of the table team to really competing at the top for a number of years until everybody else started to catch up with them. So, I really like that as an example of how you can really make a change to your organization by doing something different to everybody else, working out what your objectives are, but also understanding what your constraints are. And everybody has constraints, and they're all different. And constraints often drive creativity. So, yeah, I think the question, what are other law firms using, is the wrong question to ask. But since you asked it, I will answer it. So, I mean, typically law firms are focused on what's aligned with their financial goals. And I think the sort of clearest example is most firms are worried about cash. Have we got enough cash in the bank? Driving cash. They certainly should be. Cash is king and all of that. And one of our customers summarizes it as activity, billing, and cash, which I think is quite a neat way to look at it. Activity, how many hours have we recorded, or how many new files have we opened on fixed fee work? So that's the first level. If we've got plenty of activity, then how much are we billing? And then from the billing, how much of that billing have we got back as cash? And if you look at those three things, that's not a bad set of metrics if your financial goal is increasing the cash that's available, but it's not necessarily the best. So another way of looking at that is utilization, realization, and debtor days. Now, they're what I'd call true leading indicators. So rather than looking at activity, how much time has each individual FINA recorded? What's the utilization? That's an actionable measure, because you're saying FINA A is actually paid for 35 hours of work a week, and they're only recording 70% of that as chargeable time. Is that good or bad? And suddenly you've got a lever, you've got an indicator of what potentially needs to change. Next comes realization. So of all of the time that a FINA has recorded, how much has she billed? And what percentage of that has she billed? So taking these average percentages just gives you a clearer indicator of where action is needed and what potentially is going to be a problem further down the line. And then debtor days, the time it takes from raising a bill to getting paid is a leading indicator of how much cash you're going to get. If it takes you 120 days to get paid on average, you're going to get a lot less cash in than if you get it in 20 or 30 days. So yeah, KPIs are aligned with your financial goals, but actually making sure that they're leading indicators is a really good thing. I think personally, cash isn't necessarily the ultimate measure that most law firms need to be looking at. If they're short of cash, then absolutely. But in order to drive the business forward, from a futures perspective, gross margin by team is a really good indicator. Actually looking at how much revenue is coming from a particular team within the business and how much it's costing to run that team. Nothing to do with how much time they've recorded, just how much are we paying out in terms of salaries and professional indemnity insurance to have those people sat on those seats, and what contribution is that making overall to the firm? And if you've got that information, that's really actionable. That really gives you an indicator of what's going well in the business and what isn't. Ideally, if you could do gross margin by work type, that would be even better. The challenge with that is you really need good, solid, reliable time recording, everybody recording every minute of their day. That's a challenge in itself. It doesn't happen in most firms. But gross margin by team is a great KPI, and yeah, some of the best firms that we work with actually use that as a measure.
That's great insight and great advice. And like you said, making sure that those KPIs, whatever you do choose, are really actionable to help you make those decisions moving forward. But I love that story. And I think you're really right in actually, now you know, Graham has told you what other law firms are tracking. Track something else as well. Make sure that that isn't the only thing that your firm are tracking and caring about. And actually, it links to the stuff you mentioned before about purpose and values and what is it that you're trying to achieve. Do you care about your client satisfaction and your reviews and the feedback? Do you care about your employee satisfaction and all that good stuff that comes with that? So yeah, now you know, find something else that helps you be that niche and step out from the crowd.
Yeah, I mean, and just on that, I'm a huge fan of the concept of the balanced scorecard, which is, a really old-fashioned idea, if you like, now came out in the 70s or 80s. But the idea is that just measuring your success in terms of financial numbers really isn't a good way to build a long-term successful business. You really need to be looking at the other aspects, as you've mentioned, the people side of it, the customer side of things, and the operations side of things as well. Where are the bottlenecks in your operations? And unfortunately, although again, lawyers don't necessarily like to think of it, delivering legal services is a process. There are a number of steps, and there are often bottlenecks. And if you can identify and deal with those, then you can actually improve the throughput, improve the revenue, improve your other indicators as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that idea of a scorecard view. I think that's really easy to visualize as well. So yeah, that's a great shout. And obviously compliance comes into that as well, especially if you're struggling with that and getting that embedded into your culture, making sure that that's how people are measured and are held accountable will help embed all those things that mean to you, that mean a lot to you as a firm and what you're striving for. So, going back to the maturity model, stage 4 was discussing essentially you're moving from reactive to strategic and you're leveraging the data to help you be forward thinking, help you be predictive, look into the future. We've talked about trusting the data and everything that potentially can come with that, but can you share some practical steps and advice for becoming data ready? So, how can firms progress from where they are to utilizing the data to their advantage?
Yeah, so I mean, you touched on it on number one there, which is build confidence in the data. Until you've got data that you can trust, that everybody in the firm trusts, everything else is difficult. It's a huge barrier. So, as I said before, start to use it. Draw a line in the sand if necessary. A lot of conversations I have with firms saying, well, our data, we've got 20 years of data and it's all rubbish and there's no way we can ever clean all that up. Well, okay, well, don't clean it up then. Just start again. Think forwards, not backwards. If you can't fix the old data, start now, get the data right for the future. Because however much we talk today about the importance of data, over the next 5 to 10 years, that importance is just going to ramp up and up and up as machine learning, artificial intelligence tools start to come through, because they all absolutely rely on data. And if you haven't got reliable data, you can't take advantage of those tools. And other firms that can rely on their data will take advantage of those tools, and that will become a massive differentiator. So yeah, if you can't sort your old data, draw a line in the sand and start now, making sure you've got clean data going forward. But often it is possible to clean up some of your old data. Actually, have a look at where it's worth making investment in that. I think the other thing in utilizing data to your advantage is just aligning measurement with your business goals. And again, we've touched on it a little bit already, but be really clear about your strategic goals as a business. So that's back to this commercial mindset. It's about embracing that you're a commercial organization. Know what your goals are, and then align your measurements to that. Actually apply metrics to every aspect of your business. If you've got a business improvement plan, what are the metrics associated with each one of those? And actually make those visible, share those, not just with the people who are running that particular initiative, that particular project, but share them across the firm. Open it up and actually create incentives for people to make sure that they do. Those metrics are going in the right direction. They're hitting the targets, whatever the objectives have been, because what gets measured gets done. That's one of the oldest sayings in business, and it's as true today as it's always been. In fact, it's even more true. There are even more distractions for people who have a day job to do. If you're trying to drive change, if you're trying to improve things in your firm, you've really got to be clear on what the change is and how you're going to measure that, because otherwise it's almost inevitable that it will drift off track, and it won't deliver the results that you're looking for.
Yeah, I think that's a great shout for recording what you're trying to achieve. If there's no way to record, how could you possibly know if you've got better or worse? So yeah, I definitely think that's a great starting point. Decide what your values are, what your goals are, and make sure you're measuring, tracking some sort of metric on that. But I also love the idea of drawing a line in the sand. I think a lot of law firm leaders may have gone, oh, okay, thank God we can do that. Because you're right, sometimes looking back at 20 years of data just feels too unreasonable. Maybe you decide that you want to know how your quotes are converting, or where your referrers are coming from. Maybe just focus on that piece of data and see if you could backfill to the start of the year, perhaps. Maybe that's slightly more easier than thinking of the last 20. But you're right, sometimes you've just got to draw a line in the sand and say, we're making our mark now. This is how we're going to go moving forward. And sometimes a lot of that is just being quite specific about what you want to achieve. Set a policy, set a process, make sure everyone is aware of that and it's communicated. That, yeah, is a really simple, good start. I mean, a key we have to, of course, deal with data a lot of the time when law firms are moving systems, migrating systems. It can become really problematic if they've got outdated data. They don't know what they're collecting. It's inconsistent. Nobody seems to know why it's there or how long it's been there. Who is responsible for that? Who should be responsible for managing that data in a firm?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it's really topical, I think, today. We see a lot of discussion of this, particularly in large law, where the problem is even larger. It's multiplied really by the size of the firm. But I think to answer it, I'd start with saying who it's not, and in the vast majority of cases, it's not IT. This is responsibility for data is a why question, and IT is all about the how. So it's absolutely IT's responsibility to make sure data is kept safe. The data security, if you look at the elements of a data strategy, data security is one of those. And yeah, absolutely, that's the responsibility of IT. But actually, overall responsibility for all aspects of data, that's a completely different question. And I think you need to separate out the ownership of particular sets of data from an overall data strategy. The data strategy, I think, has to belong to senior leadership in an organization, whether that's a law firm or whether it's a FTSE 100 business. Senior leadership needs ultimately to own the strategy towards data, because data, as I was saying before, as machine learning, artificial intelligence becomes more and more significant in the way business is done, the strategy around data is going to be fundamental to making sure that that the organization can exploit that, can take advantage of it. So that's absolutely a senior leadership thing. Doesn't necessarily have to be the managing partner or the CEO, but somebody on the senior leadership team really needs to own that data strategy. But that's not to say that they need to know every detail of every field in every application that the organization is running. That's more about ownership of individual data sets. And I think the best way I've found to look at ownership of data sets is who benefits from its proper use. So I always think of marketing and BD within a law firm as a really good example here. So the example I gave before of source of business, who owns that piece of data? Well, who's going to actually make use of that data? Who's going to benefit from it? Well, absolutely. It's going to be the marketing, indeed, the marketing team essentially, because they need to know where businesses come from to actually know how effective their marketing strategy has been, how effective their marketing spend has been, where they need to increase the spend, where they need to reduce it, all of that. So absolutely, that piece of data belongs to the marketing team. It's part of the marketing data set, and that they should take ownership and accountability for that. So the fact that it's in the practice management system, which is probably nominally owned by finance or possibly IT, is completely irrelevant to the ownership, the responsibility for the data. That's the way I would look at it. And you can break these things down, and depending on the size of the organization, there'll be more or less sets of data that you want to allocate it to. But I think the reason a lot of people struggle with this is they try to identify one individual and say, who are we going to give a responsibility for data for? And it's too big. It's too big an issue, and it's too important an issue for it to be one person. What we're seeing in a lot of larger law firms is the idea of committees who are essentially collectively responsible for data. There will be a strategy senior leadership element on there, and then everybody from across the business who has ownership of any area of data comes together, because these things are interconnected. And as I said before, a lot of the marketing data might be collected in the practice management system, which is owned by finance, or it might be collected by the client intake system, which is owned by risk and compliance. But it's about the data itself, not the application that we're talking about here.
Yeah, great advice and great distinction I mean, firstly, being clear that it's IT that doesn't own the data. I think that is the easy get out clause. But you're right. They of course own the security and how it's held and the protection of it. But really breaking it down and thinking about who benefits from it, I think is a really great way to not feel so overwhelmed by all of the data. And that's what we've done in Osprey, actually. And we've seen real success in improving the quality and cleansing it and getting everything that we need. Because what I need from a marketing perspective isn't what the support team needs. And therefore, it's not top of mind to be collecting these things. So, yeah, it's about owning it because you benefit from it. And that helps you determine what the process is, what the procedures are, what's required, what's a nice to have. I think that's a really great way of breaking that down. Um, I mean, we've already spoke about AI. We cannot get around that, especially when we're talking about data. Like you said, it is required. And to be honest, even basics of automation requires really good data and really good input into a system. But unlocking the power of your data requires the right tools. And of course, we can't end this conversation between us without talking about tech and systems. So without the right systems and software in place, it is just an impossible job to input, collate, analyze data. It's basically impossible. Across your 30 years of being in legal tech, what are your lessons learned? The good, the bad, and the ugly, share them all. But what are your lessons learned for how law firms can best utilize tech to improve their business?
Yes, another really good question. And although, yeah, you just introduced that with we need to talk about tech, I think my answer to this is really that it's all about the business and not the tech. It's about using the tech. There's loads of great software out there. There's loads of great applications, and there are just huge numbers of stories of failed implementations of those great pieces of software that I've come across in my years, and and some of which in businesses that I've worked in, and a lot, to be honest, in businesses where we've replaced software that was perfectly good and was perfectly capable of doing the job, but for whatever reason the firm involved decided it wasn't. And I think there's three sort of key points I'd call out here. The first thing is use your software how it's meant to be used. So often, I come across scenarios where people are trying to bend software to work the way that they've always worked, as opposed to the way that the software was designed. And this is a particular beef of mine because I've spent an awful long time designing software, and a lot of a lot of effort goes into this, and you have to make decisions about how the software is going to be used, and it won't be right for every law firm, But in purchasing software, you need to make sure you're purchasing software that works the way that you want to, not just one that appears to have sort of a list of features that you want. Because if you get a piece of software that's designed to work one way and you try to bend it to work a different way, you waste huge amounts of time on implementation, trying to do customization, trying to do workarounds, and almost inevitably, quite soon down the road, you will find that you've got a failed implementation on your hands. You've got implementation that people are not adopting because the workarounds, the customizations, they don't work. So first of all, use software how it's meant to be used. The second thing, and this is another regular beef of mine, train your people. Make sure that when you're investing in software, actually invest in internally in the people that are going to use that, and make sure everybody knows how to use it. Make sure everybody knows why they need to use it as well. And over the years, so many examples of firms spending ridiculous amounts on the software and then not actually investing in the training. And this isn't a pitch for training services, because we provide training free of charge to our customers. So yeah, and that's because I'm so passionate about this that we just have to build it in, because I don't want systems going out to people who haven't been trained. And then thirdly, keep iterating, don't stop. Again, so many examples of organizations, particularly law firms, they implement software to go through a huge implementation project. It's hard work, they're always hard work, and they get to the end of it, breathe a sigh of relief, and don't think about it again then for another 3 to 5 years, until people are starting to complain that it needs replacing. And actually, when you get to the end of that implementation, that's the time that the hard work should really start. Because generally speaking, what you've done at that point is you've just replaced an old system. So you've replaced like with like, and you've got to that point, and as I say, breathe a sigh of relief. We've got back, and we know further back than we were. But actually, the potential value of your investment comes from how you push on then. And momentum seems to get lost so many times. So keep iterating, don't stop. And then the last thing I would say, engage with your supplier, and make sure you've got a two-way conversation going on. Give them feedback, but also listen to them. Suppliers, as we're talking about this afternoon, see a lot of law firms, see a lot of what's going on. So make sure you really engage with your supplier, because there's massive benefits there. And that's something we really invest in at Catcher with our customer success program, and I'm sure you do at Osprey. So yeah, those are the key things. So success in terms of tech tools, I think, really is there's some great tools out there, but focus on the things within the business, not just the tech.
Absolutely. My gosh, those 4 points resonated with me so hard, especially number one. Use it for how it's supposed to be built. Stop trying to shoehorn things, because you'll only get disappointed. And you're right, training, relying on your suppliers, asking them questions, probing them. Is this the best way? Is there a better way? I know Catcher's got a great client success team, so do we. Our training is free as well for that exact reason. We're not just doing it because we know how important it is. So what a great way to end the conversation, Graham. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your experience of your experience with data and tech over the last few years with law firms. It was really great to pick your brains.
Oh, thank you, Amy. It's been a pleasure.